Hello and welcome to today's show, where we're going to be talking about the rise of postmodern conservatism. My guest today, Matt McManus, has written a book on this called The Rise of Postmodern Conservatism, but you can also find sort of popular level articles and things that he's written on this sort of stuff and other books on adjacent topics. Do you want to just give a brief background about yourself for people who might not have come across your work before?
Sure. First off, thanks a lot for having me on. It's great to be here. So right now, I'm a lecturer in political science at the University of Michigan. I've worked at a bunch of different places before. We can get into that if you want. But I wrote this book around 2018 was when people asked me to do it when I was living in Mexico and working at Tec de Monterrey.
So some things that have happened since then, I guess, are going to be kind of like relevant to the themes that you talk about in the book.
Yeah, that's for sure.
But for setting the background and kind of like, clarifying terms and things that I think are useful, maybe we can talk about, as you do in the book, postmodernism, neoliberalism, and conservatism first. So if we kind of go through those one by one, and you can kind of talk about how it is that you characterize those, because there's a lot of, disagreement and polysemy in the way that people use these words. So the first one then, postmodernism. I mean, what is postmodernism?
Sure. Well, this is an extremely contentious term, as you know. It's meant a lot of different things to different people. So I'll just go through a short list and then I'll describe what it means to me in the context of the book. So first off, for a lot of people, postmodernism just refers to an aesthetic style that started to become popular depending on who you talk to in the 1960s, 1970s, really became ascendant for quite a while through the 1980s and 1990s, and then started to dribble away, if you want, in the 2000s when people started to talk about us entering a postmodern age. Exactly the most graceful term, but there you go. And usually people said that what characterized postmodern art and cultural products was this emphasis on things like pastiche, right, incorporating a wide variety of different tropes and symbols and visual cues or literary cues from extremely different sources. This blending of high art and low art, so there was this kind of flatness to the kind of cultural sources upon which it drew. A conscious rejection of modernism, of course, modernism's emphasis on rationality and linearity, that kind of thing. That's not what I mean in the book, of course, but for people who are interested in that kind of thing, there's a bajillion books on postmodern art that you can look at. Or if you want a really good example of a kind of postmodern novel, that's really very interesting. I'd really recommend Don DeLillo's White Noise. There's a movie that came out recently with Adam Driver that wasn't all that good, but that's just why it immediately came to mind, right? Then another way that people have understood postmodernism, and this is pretty much by and large the way that it's been understood on the right, is postmodernism is a kind of offensively French, hyper-skeptical, extremely dangerous school of critical theory, Marxist theory, philosophy, whatever it is that you want to call it, right? And different conservative authors have a variety of views on this, but the widespread consensus is that postmodern theorists like Foucault or Derrida, Deleuze isn't talked about as often, but sometimes he gets roped in there as well, were broadly speaking left very, very critical of the kind of esteemed pillars of Western civilization and constantly tried to lob skeptical arguments at them in order to demonstrate how Western civilizations were pretty much defined by relations of oppressor-oppressed or relations of domination, and postmodern theory was a kind of intellectual weapon to overcome a lot of those things. And to be clear, there is definitely a distinctively postmodern turn in elements of continental philosophy. It doesn't often have the characteristics that a lot of people on the right project onto it, but it does have some of them, and we can talk about that if you want. But the main way that I understand postmodernism in the book is as what's sometimes called a cultural condition, which is actually in many ways the way that many of these people defined it anyway. And what's meant by that is that postmodernism is a kind of attitude or cultural disposition that can be reflected in a wide array of different areas: philosophy, politics, art, etc. But what kind of unifies them, qua leotard, is this skepticism towards grand or meta narratives, right? This idea that there's a kind of unified framework into which, through which we can filter and understand the world. And in my book, what I argue is this account is, to a certain extent, right, but it doesn't account for how it is that people can try to assemble new kinds of grand narratives out of bits and pieces of the kind of existing grand narratives that existed prior to postmodernity. And this is an argument that you see mostly articulated by Marxist writers, interestingly enough. That's why I said, the right characterization of postmodern theory is so often mistaken, right? People like Frederick Jameson, Mark Fisher, Terry Eagleton, Dave Harvey all wrote about postmodernity as a cultural condition brought about by primarily late capitalism, but other factors as well. And for the most part, they're uniformly critical of it for all the reasons that you might expect coming from Marxists.
So in terms of thinking about it from that other angle, like sort of as a philosophical theory or a philosophical school or something, of course, not many people sort of self-identify as postmodernists. Are there any characteristics that you think are useful, to kind of keep in mind there? So you said a kind of skepticism to meta-narratives. I guess in my own thinking, it's been like an interest in historical influences or etymology of language and stuff like that. What sort of themes, characterize the kind of content of thinkers that might be considered postmodern?
Absolutely. Well, this is going to sound kind of pretentiously academic, because it is.
Sure.
But it's important to note that, like any other school of thought or any other tradition of thought, postmodern authors very often disagreed with one another about an enormous number of things. So it's very, very dangerous to kind of paint them all with the same brush. Nonetheless, a lot of these figures, particularly in France, kind of emerged during what's called the 68 generation, right? This kind of revolutionary period in France where it almost looked like the students were going to seize control of Paris, overthrow the de Gaulle government, and install, if not a Marxist government, at least a socialist government, right? It's the 60s, right? It was a very, very kind of a new left time. And because of the failure of 68, amongst other things, many of these authors came to reject or at least be skeptical of things like Marxism and socialism, while nonetheless still wanting to carry on a kind of leftist agitation. And what's very interesting about them is very often what they decided to draw upon for inspiration weren't the kind of classical canon of left-wing thinkers. People like Marx, Thomas Paine, that kind of thing. Instead, they drew very heavily on what we might call reactionary or even hyper-reactionary thinkers like Martin Heidegger. Friedrich Nietzsche was an enormous influence. For instance, Derrida was hugely influenced by Heidegger, right? Foucault once overtly described himself as a Nietzschean. You get the idea, right? And what kind of what inspiration they drew from this was this extremely skeptical attitude towards anything that presented itself as offering a teleological vision of history or teleological vision of progress. And that's true of, for instance, liberalism. It's also true of Marxism, right? Many liberals and many Marxists held that if you understand history properly, what you see is the kind of spread of rationality, the development of forces of production and economic relations that are going to be ever more capable of gratifying human needs. And also, political institutions are becoming more free, more equal, etc. Rather like Nietzsche and Heidegger, a lot of the postmodern authors said, no, that's actually not the case, right? Just to give, two quick examples. In Michel Foucault's classic book, Discipline and Punish, he argues that there's this kind of snobbish attitude that many liberals especially take around issues of punishment and crime. And the idea is, once upon a time, we did barbaric things like torture people, execute them in public. We no longer do that. We've become more humane and we become a more compassionate society. And Foucault's response to that is to say, well, no, hold on, right? Yes, it is the case that in earlier periods of human history, we would brutally torture and execute people in public, right? Discipline and Punish opens with this really ghastly scene of attempted regicide being torn apart by his limbs, right? But Foucault says, starting in the 19th century, what we started to do instead was, rather than punishing the body, we began to punish the soul of human beings by trying to remake them into ever more efficient cogs in the giant industrial economy that was emerging. And what you start to see is the growth of a prison industrial system in developing or developed countries like the United Kingdom, France, the USA, etc., that was far more vast than anything that existed before. What contemporary Foucauldians would point out is that while, for instance, the torture of the odd regicide in the medieval ages was a horrible thing, it was very infrequently carried out, right? You didn't exactly see these kind of spectacular executions being carried out en masse. By contrast, in a country like, say, the United States, the land of the free, by the end of the 1990s, there were more people in jail in the United States than there were in the Soviet Union, right? Millions upon millions upon millions. And Foucault's intimation from that would be to say, is this really progress, right? Doesn't really look like it. If anything, the state has gotten more intrusive, more involved in people's lives, et cetera, et cetera. And aligned with this is a critique of the kind of modes of thought that lead to the development of this prison industrial system. Although the relationship between the practice of discipline and the modes of thought or the discourses underpinning it, it's very complicated in his work. And then just to give one other quick example, you have people like, excuse me.
That's right.
Richard Rorty, right? So Richard Rorty was a quintessentially American figure, broadly speaking, on the American left, right? Sometimes called himself a socialist, sometimes just called himself a very liberal kind of guy, pretty indifferent to all those things, and that's kind of the point, right? And what Rorty argued from Philosophy in the Mere Nature forward is, look, we have very long in the Western world tried to place both our epistemologies and our understandings of morality on a firm kind of foundation. In epistemology, he sometimes referred to this as a kind of Archimedean point, right? Where we say, this is the kind of foundation upon which I'm going to build my theory of knowledge. And then, I'm just going to move upwards from there. This is true of Cartesianism, empiricism, et cetera, et cetera. In the same way, moral theories will say, I'm going to start my moral philosophy from the basis that maximizing happiness is what we should do, or following rules, deontic rules, is what we should do, and then everything else kind of flows from that. And Rorty's argument is really there's just no good arguments for these kinds of things. If you interrogate them closely enough, and he was very inspired by people like Heidegger and Wittgenstein on this point, you realize that the kind of foundations that we think that we're standing on are just air, right? They kind of evaporate when subjected to a sufficiently skeptical kind of philosophical scrutiny. And what made Rorty interesting, if you want, as he said, really morality and knowledge don't need these foundations, right? What matters is less that we have a kind of Archimedean point upon which to build knowledge, or a capital T true foundation for morality, and more that these ideas just kind of work. They're part of our public culture, whether that's a scientific culture, whether that's a liberal democratic culture. And as long as they seem to be working pretty well and making society more humane and allowing us to build things like iPhones, what right do we have to really complain about those things? Now, I am very critical of these outlooks. I want to make that emphatically clear. But they both have insights, right? And I think this is something that people sometimes underappreciate, right? Going all the way back to Socrates, for that matter, really. There's a long history of skeptical ideas emerging in Western thought that are sometimes generative and useful. To use the Socratic metaphor, they're kind of like gadflies that press us to think harder about these things. And I kind of lump a lot of the postmodern thinkers into that group, right? I don't necessarily agree with them. I'm not a skeptic either about morality or knowledge, but it's useful to kind of have yourself probed and pressed a little bit that way. And you can profit from reading these authors as long as you don't take them, perhaps appropriately enough, too seriously. I say appropriately enough because they themselves didn't really often want to be taken all that seriously.
So that's great. So we've got this characterization of postmodernism then, and then in your book, I suppose it's when that meets neoliberalism that we kind of are able to talk about this postmodern conservatism. So what is neoliberalism then, to define that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's probably no term that's more contentious in the economic lexicon than neoliberalism, right? Everybody likes to throw it out. Everybody has a different meaning for it. And it's, for the most part, become a pejorative in today's discourse. Not true once upon a time, right? So usually the reason why we talk about neoliberalism is Milton Friedman published an article in the 1950s talking about who the neoliberals were, and then it just kind of got picked up by a lot of critics of these schools of thought, and then things have just rolled ever since then. So neoliberalism has been defined as everything from a kind of approach to governance to, of course, an economic system, but the way that I've primarily define it is as a kind of ethic, right? That obviously is very, very grounded in the rationality of the market. And I don't use rationality necessarily as a term of endorsement, right? And then it's extended more broadly into other ethical areas of life. So one of the examples I give, and this is where it complements the kind of postmodern culture, is a lot of the neoliberal thinkers insisted that the way that people should approach ethical decisions, like whether to get married, for example, or whether to have kids, is rather the same way that you should approach whether to buy chocolate or vanilla ice cream, right? You ask yourself, well, which of these decisions will be utility maximizing to me based upon my own subjective preferences? If I think that vanilla ice cream will make me happier, then I'll get vanilla ice cream. Although who would actually think that way? I don't know, right? It's been called vanilla ice cream for a reason. And in the same way, you think to yourself, like, should I have a family? Should I be Christian? Should I be a believer in the American nation? You're like, well, Does it gratify utility maximization, et cetera, et cetera? And the argument of many critics of neoliberalism, and actually I should add, some of the neoliberals themselves, like Gary Becker, was that the extension of this ethic into the life world would lead to a kind of retrenchment of the basic relations of production that are characteristic of the capitalist mode of production, right? And in my book, I'm extremely critical of neoliberalism, precisely because I think that it helps to induce this kind of relativistic mentality, so characteristic of postmodern culture. Because when you start to treat ethics and morality like it's just a consumer choice, are you really going to be all that surprised when people say, look, whether I'm going to be a Nazi or a socialist or a liberal, that's just a matter of personal taste. And you know what? Today, Nazism appeals to me. And you know what? Also seems like it'll be pretty good for me socially and when I'm in my online spaces. So fuck it. Let's just roll with it. Right. And I have very little patience for that kind of approach to serious ethical questions.
Right.
And by the way, Justin, I am sorry. If you like vanilla, my wife does too. Never makes sense to me, but you know, it is what it is.
So could you speak a little bit to, people often reference the sort of Francis Fukuyama stuff, the end of history, and that sort of general attitude in the sort of the 90s to the 2000s. I mean, is that very important to understanding neoliberalism as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to be clear. Fukuyama is often used as a kind of stand-in for a broader set of attitudes. If you actually read his book, it's quite a bit more subtle and granular than it's given credit for. But to make a long story medium short, let's call it that, in the 1980s and the 1990s, Fukuyama became associated with this thesis that we'd reached the end of history. And what he meant by that very broadly is that a kind of liberal, really neoliberal capitalism had defeated its enemies on the right, fascism, and then on the left, communism, and consequently that we'd reached an era where there were no longer going to be any big ideological struggles because there's really nothing to struggle about any longer. It seemed like we'd reached kind of consensus worldwide that neoliberal capitalism was the best system to organize society. It could come in slightly different flavors. You could get Tony Blair style neoliberalism, or you could get George Bush, the first, kind of style neoliberalism, but it was going to be a flavor of neoliberalism. Now, Fukuyama himself was insistent that, look, people might very well be very unhappy about the end of history, precisely because there's this deep, sometimes even dark human urge to mean something in historical terms. And at the end of his book, he actually says, we're kind of entering an era of the Nietzschean last man, where everyone is just going to kind of give in to these consumeristic impulses, assume that the only thing that we really have to care about any longer is which Game of Thrones character is going to die next week, right? Or House of the Dragon character is going to die next week. And there's probably going to be, he assumed, a certain cadre of people that have this yearning for what he called thymotic recognition, right? This kind of maximal recognition by society for their greatness. And he projected that they might restart history. And interestingly enough, Fukuyama said Donald Trump or people like him might exactly be these thymotic individuals, right? So again, credit where due, right? He was never quite the shill for the status quo that he was taken to be. But this kind of attitude throughout the 1990s that we'd reached the kind of end of all these ideological struggles was quite ubiquitous, right? As Slavoj Žižek reminds us, you could even ask pretty dedicated Marxists and leftists through the 1990s and early 2000s, do you think that, an alternative is possible to, say, capitalism or to the neoliberal status quo? And they would mouth something about, in the eternal horizon, all things change, et cetera, et cetera. But deep down, to use Zizek's term, everyone was kind of a closet Fukuyamist, right? And I think we've very transparently moved beyond that time period right now. The irony being that the end of history really only lasted about 25 years, and we've now very clearly entered the end of history period. But nonetheless, the reason this is associated with things like postmodernity is, of course, because if nothing really of historical significance can happen any longer, then there's nothing that really can give a sense of thick meaning to our political and ideological and religious struggles, except ransacking the past for symbols and tropes and ideas that might have once meant something, and we'll try to rejuvenate that sense of meaning. But we're almost incapable of kind of creating new ways of thinking about things because there's just really nothing new to create ideologically and I suppose morally speaking.
Okay, great. So we've got this kind of neoliberal milieu, we've got these kind of postmodern ideas floating around, and then how should we characterize conservatism then to understand how it reacts to these conditions?
Well, there's a lot of different definitions of, I'm not even going to use conservatism, even though that's the term I use in the book, the political right. Some people characterize the political right as committed to tradition, for example, right? The maintenance of traditional value structures in our society. But as I point out in that book, and particularly in my recent book, The Political Right and Equality, which people can also check out if they want. I'm quite proud of that book. It's very hard to square this idea of preserving or conserving traditions with figures like, say, Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, right? Margaret Thatcher always insisted from the 1980s onwards that her goal was, to use her terms, to remake the soul of the nation. And economics was just the means for that. And that's very much a kind of revolutionary ambition, right? Ronald Reagan used to like to cite people like Thomas Paine, the ultra American revolutionary, really it was English, right? But we'll let that slide, and say we have it in our power to make the world anew or to start the world anew. Or, you know, just take more recently, somebody like Donald Trump promising to kind of come in and smash the Washington elite and the kind of hegemonic consensus that's existed for the last 25 years. And apparently he was very successful at that, right? So this idea that conservatism is fundamentally about preserving traditions never really resonated all that much with me, because it's so very easy to find numerous conservative individuals who will say things like, as Glenn Elmer's put it, conservatism is no longer enough. What we need is counter-revolution, or even to create something new in the world. Another classic definition of conservatism stresses that it's about a kind of prudentialist caution, or I should say the political right. Now, I think that there's more grounds to this definition, right? There's definitely a kind of Burkean attitude that you'll see moderate right-wingers adopt that suggests we should have change, but not change that goes too fast, right? We need to change what we must in order to conserve what we can, right? But again, it's very hard to square this idea of caution with the more radical intimations or iterations of the right, particularly today, right? Where going back to the counter-revolutionary tradition that emerged in Europe in the 18th century, many of these people blanched at caution, right? Suggested that what we need is radical action in order to roll back the rising tide of democracy, liberalism, and this commitment to a society of liberty, equality, and solidarity for all. And as much as I kind of just defended the Burkean virtues of prudence and caution, Burke himself fell into this camp near the end of his life, right? Where he was constantly writing letters to figures across Europe saying that a total war was required against the French Republic, saying that normie conservatives weren't doing enough to kind of roll back these revolutionary energies because if they were able to spread or even allowed to just mutate and gestate in France, eventually it would become threatening to the aristocracy and the established order, and he didn't want that. So again, I've never been convinced by this idea that the right is defined by this cautious or prudentialist approach to politics. There are definitely some people on the right who embody these virtues, and I think that there's something to be said for them, right? I don't think change for its own sake is necessarily a good thing. But my definition of the right is actually drawn from, of all people, Friedrich Hayek, right? So in Friedrich Hayek's book, The Constitution of Liberty, there's a little essay at the end of it called Why I'm Not a Conservative, which is true. And in it, he says, when you boil all the crap away, what the right is committed to is this idea that there are recognizably superior persons in society, and these recognizably superior persons are entitled to really just more, right? More status, more power, more money, obviously, more political agency, you name it, right? And what I point out is that, well, two things. First off, every different person on the right has a different understanding of who these recognizably superior persons are. For people in, say, the manosphere now, it's men, right? For people on, the kind of racist right, it's the white race, right? Or maybe even European civilization. For right libertarians or paleo conservatives, it's the affluent, right? The kind of movers and shakers that build things in society. But there's always this idea that there's a recognizably superior group in society, and everyone would benefit if they were just given more of pretty much everything, right? And the second point that I bring up is they all disagree on the steps that need to be taken to ensure that these recognizably superior persons are entrenched in the right position in society. Usually conservatives will argue that we more or less have the right social hierarchy intact because the right people are at the top where they should be. And so the goal is just to defend that against criticisms of the left. But in circumstances where, to use Corey Robin's terms, the right starts to think that the left has been in the driver's seat for too long, that they've undone the proper forms of hierarchical social organization, the right can become quite radical and insist that we need counter-revolution, radical and transformative change, authoritarianism, and to use the kind of hard power of the state to remake the world in their image. And there's a variety of different examples of this that we can get into.
So yeah, I have some questions that sort of explore the historical antecedents of sort of, you know, contemporary postmodern conservatism, kind of in the direction you follow it in the book. So we talked about Bork a little bit, so I won't go into that question. But then you also raise, and I've not heard this person's name spoken aloud before, so Maistre. And you know, I think you say something about potentially the sort of origins of fascist ideology as well, going back to their thoughts. So could you expand a little bit on that and how it sits in the conservative tradition?
Sure. Well, I should just add, this isn't a thesis that's original to me, right? Isaiah Berlin famously characterized de Maistre as the origin, or at least the intellectual origin point of fascism quite some time ago. And there's some good textual evidence to support that, right? Major fascist thinkers like Julius Evola and Carl Schmitt both drew upon de Maistre as an influence. And you can kind of see the stamp of many of his outlooks in, you know, a broader array of different figures, like, say, Mussolini, for example. But to make a very long story short, what is interesting about de Maistre is three things, right? So first off, de Maistre was very much of the school of thought that in response to the French Revolution, cautious kind of management or even just rolling it back was not sufficient. What was required was radical, indeed violent action to completely stamp it out forever, right? And the reason he wanted this kind of spectacular violence was both because he thought that would teach everyone a lesson, yes, but also because he thought that the use of violence in society has a kind of sublime quality to it that people almost associate with these religious attitudes. And if you are able to demonstrate to people that you command power over life and death, then they are more likely to ascribe these almost divine qualities onto you. That'll make it very unlikely that you're ever going to want to resist reactionary authorities again, right? And it's this affective dimension to violence that makes his work very, very interesting, right? Secondly, de Maistre is very interesting because he's one of the first major reactionaries to, as much contempt as he has for the French revolutionaries, express some admiration for them, right? They changed the world. And as somebody who was a great admirer of power, energy, and dynamism, de Maistre almost can't help but find something appealing about that, right? He wrote these laudatory comments, for instance, about Napoleon, although, of course, after Napoleon was safely sequestered away in St. Helena. And what de Maistre does very effectively is kind of present conservatism as actually better able to meet the emotional needs of those who are attracted to leftism than leftism itself, right? To just give one very good example of this, when commenting on this desire for a Republican or participatory government, because, you know, Republicans argued that it elevated the ordinary people to have a say in how things were done. De Maistre says, no. It's actually monarchy that most elevates ordinary people. Why? Because they're able to participate in its splendor. Although, of course, from a distance and without possessing, shall we say, robust political agency, right? But he'd say, you know, very often people like serving a leader-like figure who's larger than life, more powerful than an ordinary person, because they feel that they're kind of extensions of that person and share in a part of his power and his splendor, right? And this is a very innovative technique that many on the right are going to pick up again and again and again. To use Edmund Neal's term, the right will often be characterized by developing symbolic opposites to left-wing concepts in order to refute them. Think about, you know, white lives matter or blue lives matter contemporaneously, right. Et cetera, et cetera. And then last but not least, what I think is very interesting about de Maistre, and there's a lot of very interesting things about de Maistre, is de Maistre is one of the first figures to argue quite cogently that the right is actually the kind of punk insurrectionary movement in the Western world, right? He really has no patience for these kind of doddering old forms of conservatism that just suggest that what you need to do is emphasize tradition, responsiveness, and old-fashioned values. He does appeal to a lot of those things, but he's very insistent that in order to make political power efficacious, you need to present yourself as being exciting, daring, bold, and align yourself with all these kinds of sublime qualities. And by contrast, he tends to present democracy or republicanism as staid, dull, gerontic, and very much the kind of purview of these out of touch elitist intellectuals who spend far too much time in coffee houses reading Voltaire and don't really understand the effective dimensions of politics, right? So again, that is what makes de Maistre such an interesting figure to me, right? Now, his work is notably unsystematic. Even sympathetic commentators have pointed this out, right? You'll scour his work for a kind of system in vain. And he shares that in common with Bork, right? But it's these kinds of gems of insight that characterize his oeuvre that are going to be picked up and radicalized and sometimes even systematized by other right-wing philosophers, particularly on the radical right.
And then some of the figures that you kind of pick up on as having thought that leads into this postmodern conservatism, Oakeshott, Lord Devlin, and Bork. Could you briefly just kind of like touch on each of them and what's important about their thought for understanding postmodern conservatism?
Sure, absolutely. Well, the reason I bring up these three figures, and there's a lot more we can talk about, is if you grew up in the 1980s and the 1990s, very often, particularly in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom, you would see conservatism associated with a defense of things like reason, universalism, even classical liberal values, right? Particularly in the United Kingdom and in where I come from, say, Canada, right? And what I point out is that there are definitely strands of right-wing thought that lean in that direction, but there's always been a kind of deep undercurrent of irrationalist right-wing thought that is extremely skeptical of rationalism, universalism, Enlightenment values, and liberalism, for that matter. And indeed, I point out that in many ways, this genealogy is quite a bit older than the kind of streams of conservative thought that align themselves with the liberal tradition. It goes all the way back to people like Edmund Burke, who once said that his essay on the sublime and the beautiful, that the influence of reason on people's behavior and modes of thinking is way, way, way more diminished than people think. And Joseph de Maistre in numerous works used to say that philosophy, and what he means by that is Enlightenment philosophy, is fundamentally a destructive force or a disintegrationist force, because what it does is it undermines people's faith in the dogmas and the authorities that are necessary to glue society together. And Oakeshott, Devlin, and Bork kind of continue in this line of conservative thought, although, as we'll see, Bork and Oakeshott are both complicated cases. So Michael Oakeshott, for people who don't know, was a British philosopher. Most people regard him as one of the four most important right-wing intellectuals of the 20th century. I'm sure people will want to know who those are, so they're usually listed as Michael Oakeshott, F.A. Hayek, Carl Schmitt, and then Leo Strauss. Okay, we won't get into all the others. But what Oakeshott argued is that in his essay, Rationalism in Politics, and his essays on conservatism, is that fundamentally the left is defined by this commitment to rationalism, right? Because what defines a left-winger? A left-winger is somebody who pays very little attention to things like local attachments, national attachments, says fundamentally we just need to look at people as individuals, and individuals need to more or less be treated equally, and we cannot ascribe any moral weight to arbitrary factors like where they were born, whether they're part of our community, whether they believe in our faith tradition, et cetera, right? And Oakeshott had in mind the kind of utilitarian-inflected utilitarianism that was extremely popular with, say, the British Labour Party in the mid-century, right? This idea that, the state will sit there and it's going to approach society like a giant machine, and it's going to try to oil that machine as well as possible for the benefit of all. And Oakeshott was extremely critical of these viewpoints, arguing to be a conservative is to have a preferential attachment to the local, to the way things are, to the kind of people that look like you and talk like you and think like you. And from his perspective, it's this kind of anthropological difference that really defines the difference between left and right. And he ultimately thinks, of course, that conservatives just have a better anthropological understanding of who human beings are, right? These kinds of nebus socialist intellectuals who will say things like, yeah, one world, one people, just don't understand how, people who live in Devonshire, right, are really attracted to being, people from Devonshire, right? Or how, something like Brexit could emerge because people really don't want to be part of cosmopolitan institutions like the European Union. He didn't live to see that, but you get the idea, right? And his work is very sophisticated, I have to say. I want to make very clear, I'm not one of those people who says that the political right is, to use Russell Kirk, the great conservative intellectual's phrase, the kind of party of idiots, right? There are many, many preeminent conservative intellectuals that are highly intelligent and very interesting, and Oakeshott is very much one of them. Although I have a lot of criticisms of his work that we can get into if you want. Moving on to Lord Devlin. Devlin is actually the one who I think most antecedes or most can teach us the most about the emergence of things like Trumpism. Okay. The reason is that Devlin, for those of you who don't know, was an important judge in mid-century in the mid-century United Kingdom, an enormously influential figure, not just in British law, but also the kind of broader Anglo-Saxon kind of order liberty approach to legality. And what Devlin argued in a variety of different essays, but most notably his collection, The Enforcement of Morals, as he says, ultimately, when we ask ourselves whether or not society has a right to regulate the moral behavior of its members, the answer has to be yes. And the reason is because each society has its own moral outlook, and that's usually defined in religious terms, right? In the United Kingdom, it's Christianity. In India, it's Hinduism. In Saudi Arabia, it would be Islam, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Devlin is notably agnostic on whether any of these are true, right? Which is, if you think about it for a moment, really striking, right? He says it could very well be the case that Christianity is just a whole bunch of made-up BS, or Hinduism is not true at all. That doesn't really matter, right? What's less important than the truth of these religious views is the fact that people hold them, and they serve as a kind of glue that binds society together. And when liberals and socialists and leftists come along saying that individuals have rights over and against society, what they're essentially trying to do is unstick that glue and basically dissolve society back down to a collection of rights-bearing individuals. And he had none of this. By the way, the example he was thinking of was, of course, these arguments in the Wolfenden Report for the decriminalization of homosexuality. But the other important takeaway, beyond just this kind of almost hyper-relativistic attitude about morality that he still insists very much upon enforcing, indeed, it's precisely because morality is so fragile that it needs to be enforced so stringently by the state, is his argument that if we want to ascertain what the kind of common moral view of society is, we don't ask the intellectuals, right? Because the intellectuals often don't know. They're the kinds of people who sit around at Oxford University developing things like analytical Marxism, for example, right? Or asking themselves, whether there's any firm foundation for our moral views and saying no and then getting upset about that. The person you ask, in his expression, is the man on the Clapham omnibus, or the right-thinking man, or the reasonable man. He's used these terms somewhat interchangeably. And he says the man on the Clapham omnibus is basically, a beer-loving, football-loving guy, who works his job, comes home, cracks open a few, smokes a couple cigarettes, and he doesn't think all that much about politics all that often, but he does know how he feels about things. And in the 1950s, he didn't like gay people. Today, he doesn't much like immigrants because he thinks it's weird. He doesn't really much care for it. And it's just not natural, right? It's not the way things are done around here. And Devlin says this person does not need to be, to use his terminology, a rational person. If you were to ask him, well, why is it you don't like gay people? Why is it you don't like immigrants? Why is it that you think crime rates are rising when you go into a minority neighborhood, but they're not, in fact? And Devlin says, basically shut up, right? He does not have to account for his views to you. They can very much just be a matter of prejudice, or to use his term, common sense. What matters is that he holds these views, and his views are the ones that prevail in society, because if we press on them too hard, the common moral glue that binds us together will disintegrate, right? Now, Devlin, I want to be very clear, was a populist, but not necessarily a Democrat. And this is very important, right? It's not for, we're not going to determine what the common morality is by, to use this expression, a counting of heads. Instead, it's for elite judges like himself to ascertain what the reasonable man thinks about something. And from his perspective, the reasonable man didn't like homosexuality, and so homosexuality can be banned, right? And this, to me, is kind of a model of what a lot of kind of right-wing, a model of the structure of a lot of right-wing populist politics, right? Insisting on speaking on behalf of the common man, and really, really very critical of this kind of over-intellectualized approach to morality, but not necessarily democratic, rather it's demagogic, right? Because it's still for the elites in the conservative movement like Devlin to make the judgment call about what the common morality is going to be, and indeed how to enforce it using state power, right? So then last but not least, by the way, do you have any questions? I know I've gone on for a while.
No, I've got questions coming up, but yeah, this section, if you want to keep kind of going through it, and then we can get into some of that stuff.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I don't want to kind of ramble on too long.
Yeah,
so Robert Bork, for people who don't know, was a very influential judge and legal theorist in the United States. He's probably most famous as, if not the father, at least the godfather of originalism, which some of your listeners might be familiar with. It's this idea that, you should really take seriously what the drafters of the Constitution said, and that really is the only meaning that the Constitution should be given. But what was interesting about Bork is he was characterized by some as a postmodern conservative because the kind of arguments that he gives for conservatism are a strange combination of populism, this emphasis on a kind of liberal value, complemented by social conservatism, and this emphasis on difference. That's kind of the most interesting thing. So Bork follows people like Michael Oakeshott in saying, contra what the liberals in the United States might say about how fixated they are on identity and pluralism, etc. Really, it's conservatives who are interested in difference. Why? Because he says liberals are fundamentally committed to equality. Which from his perspective means they want to treat everyone the same, and they want everyone to more or less wind up in the same place, which, by the way, I should say is one of the worst takes on liberalism you're ever going to see, right? But Bork was not known for his charity to opposing views, okay? But in Coercing Virtue, he says, what distinguishes the conservative from the liberal is that conservatives have this fundamental respect for difference. They respect that people start off in different places, they wind up in different places, they have different value systems, and they don't want to impose this kind of egalitarian uniformity across society. Now, as I point out in my book, Bork's understanding of difference is very, very, very skewed, right? Because you could very easily push back on him and say, well, if we're really in the business of respecting difference, what about the difference of an LGBTQ person? What about the difference of an Arab who wants to just live his merry life in the southwestern United States, right? Those aren't the kind of differences that Bork is interested in. What he's interested in is difference understood in hierarchical terms, right? There are different kinds of people. Some of them are going to be at the bottom of a social hierarchy, and some of them are going to be at the top. And it's entirely appropriate that this is the way that society should be organized. And the way that I usually describe this to my students is that if you want to understand how the right conceives difference, it's pyramidal, right? There's this idea that there's going to be people at the bottom, some people in the middle, and then a few at the top. And each one of them is going to have a kind of different rank and a different status and a different set of agency ascribed to them. They'll all need one another, but clearly the people at the top are going to have a lot more than people at the bottom. By contrast, the left or liberal approach to difference tends to be much more mosaic, right? Like, every thread in society contributes to the other without any one of them dominating. But this kind of irrationalist emphasis on the importance of difference and really privileging tradition and context over this universalizing kind of rational impetus to treat people equally. That's, again, where I say you see the kind of anti-rationalism or irrationalism that's foundational to things like Borkianism, even if every now and then he could gesture, probably because he's American, in a more kind of universalistic, rationalistic direction.
So would it be right in saying, the general sort of themes, right, amongst these thinkers, it's going to be a kind of skepticism towards idealized models of rationality, the reach of reason, what reason can do, maybe even an emphasis on the contingency of like values and institutions that we have, while still wanting to kind of maintain and uphold them? Are these sort of common themes that you're going to consider broadly sort of postmodern, that then, feed into the way that more contemporary conservatives will think about these things.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So one of the emblematic features of postmodern culture, again, is this insistence that any attempt to kind of rationally adjudicate what is right or wrong and what is true is untrue is just doomed to fail. Right now, to go back to the early point, postmodern theorists and philosophers believe that this would create that such a cultural environment or intellectual environment might actually create space for this more left approach to difference, right? Once we realize that there's no reason for privileging or normative outlooks over those of others, we might be more willing to listen to them or tolerate them or dialogue with them. But what I point out in the book is that actually it's really the right that has profited probably most from this kind of postmodern environment. Why? Well, because the right has always had more intellectual and cultural resources to say, okay, if we're not going to buy into these universalistic, rationalistic, liberal narratives anymore, then what we should do instead is emphasize the affective connection that I have with my people and with my preferred way of life, and that's shared by others who look like me and talk like me and think like me. And if you come and you tell me that I'm wrong, well, on what basis do you make that claim, right? My preference for that is entirely legitimate, at least within the very kind of constrained epistemic confines that we now live within. And so I argue in the book, and this is maybe spoiling things a little bit, that the left really needs to move away from a lot of these kinds of postmodern fixations with identity and with affect, and kind of recover, if you want to call it this, the Enlightenment heritage of this commitment to universalism and the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity for all. Because I think it was a serious mistake for left-wing intellectuals to lean too heavily on anti-rationalism of the sort that they picked up from figures like Nietzsche and Heidegger. Even if, again, I want to point out there were interesting philosophical and intellectual insights that were gleaned from that.
So I do have questions about some of the kind of contemporary movements, and I think most of those are going to be cast in a very negative light. So I have a slightly different question about whether you think there's room for like a positive vision of postmodern conservatism. So partly how I came across your work was for the past maybe year or two, I've been kind of considering myself something like I considered myself as a postmodernist first, which I actually came across that through the avenue of philosophy and studying Wittgenstein first, and then I came across these postmodern thinkers. And then in my political thinking, I came across One Nation conservatism, and I kind of liked a lot of the values and stuff, which is a bit of a different tradition, I think, to some of these conservative thinkers. And there are popular figures like Rory Stewart, who I listen to, who seems very, pro woke, whatever you might consider that to be very progressive, but then also consider themselves conservatives in a certain sense. So I wonder if you think there's any kind of a positive vision for postmodern conservatism that isn't going to be as negative as some of the things that we'll talk about as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to add, there are people on the right who have identified as postmodern conservatives. Probably the most preeminent figure that I can think of in this regard was a Catholic author called Peter Lawler, who wrote some very interesting books like Postmodernism Rightly Understood in the 1990s. And what he argued is, modernity has been an unrequited disaster for people who want to gain the sense of stability in their life. Why? Because one of the problems with liberalism is that it induces this kind of relativistic attitude about things. He thinks that liberalism is the kind of relativistic creed because it says, look, you shouldn't rely upon tradition or religion in order to sort out your sense of who it is that you are. You should instead define that for yourself, right? Engage in what some people call a kind of expressive individualism or self-creation. And Lawler's argument is that this has left really a lot of people, but especially young men, adrift in the world without anything really to guide them or give them a sense of what their identity should be, particularly when, from Lawler's perspective, they're constantly being scolded by feminists. This term wasn't existing in the 1990s. He would refer to politically correct actors, but the woke, et cetera, et cetera. And he says, inevitably, these people are going to turn to a kind of postmodern conservatism. What he meant by that, of course, is that their conservatism is going to be stamped by many features of modernity. For example, he says it's very unlikely that you're going to see conservatives in the 21st century abandon a commitment to something like free speech, for example. older conservatives used to be very critical of free speech, but that's just not going to happen in the 21st century. But they are going to be committed to this idea of stable communal structures, national identity. He hoped, of course, a return to a kind of thick religious identity. Now, I'm very critical of all this as a proud man of the left, right? But just to be clear, I don't think that this is a what's the way to put it? I don't think that this is an implausible position. It is. People are capable of arguing cogently for this. And if I were to criticize it, it wouldn't be by dismissing it. It would have to be at a very granular level. And I have a section on Lawler in my book. I learned a lot from him. And if people are interested in learning what a kind of positive vision of postmodern conservatism would look like, excuse me, my cat wanted to say hi to everybody. I'd really recommend either his book, Stuck with Virtue, Postmodernism, Rightly Understood. Those are the two texts I go to.
Great. So now to move on to some of the more negative manifestations then. I suppose the first thing that I've got a question about is how you see this affecting, popular political discourse. So I think, people are going to be familiar with Jordan Peterson's postmodern neo-Marxism, Ben Shapiro destroying leftists on university campuses, Stephen Crowder's, I forget what it was called, the thing he did on, Change My Mind, that was it, that became a big meme. And how do you see these popular levels sort of influencers who are communicating politics and political values to people being influenced by these postmodern conservative themes?
Well, the way that I think that they're influenced is twofold, right? First off, they are very much embedded in the kind of technological hyper-real media sphere that emerged in the postmodern epoch, which is something that we didn't really talk too much about, right? Sorry, my cat really wants to get involved with this here. Come on. Okay. Down you go. Here, go get this. There you go. Sorry, she's only 3 months old, so she's still, in that mischievous phase of life. And what I mean by that is they were very online. They very much understood how to cater to audiences in that vein. And for all they would sometimes gesture towards this idea of being rational, Socratic interlocutors, anyone who spent any time with their works will know that very often the source of their appeal was this extremely angry, very militant, very, very kind of strident approach to conservatism. And you saw that even in the approach they took to things like debate, right? If you've ever watched Ben Shapiro debate anyone, these aren't Plato's Republic, right? It's not like he's sitting there being like, well, let's very carefully mince the arguments that Karl Marx put forward in Das Kapital. As you know, I'm relying on translation X and you're relying on translation Y. So maybe we should break down the meaning of reification and labor first. No, it's about kind of generating these extremely affective, not effective, although they are that, kind of takedowns of people that affirms your audience in their identity and leads you to think that irregardless of whatever rational arguments the other side might have been able to put forward had they been given the time, all that just can be very easily dismissed, right? And this is the kind of thing, as I point out in my book, that really plays quite well in an internet age, right? Where, generally speaking, people don't have that much of an attention span any longer, certainly not when they're kind of doom scrolling through Twitter. And I'm very inspired by this, as is my good friend Jason Hanan in his book, Trolling Ourselves to Death. I'd recommend people read that if they're interested, by a media theorist called Neil Postman, right? So there are problems with Postman's theory. We don't need to get into too many of them. But one of the things that Postman points out is, look, there are many wonderful things about the modern age and modern media, right? Who would have thought, back on the day, you would have access to an encyclopedia's worth of knowledge all on our phone, right? It's remarkable. Reminds me of the Arthur C. Clarke point that any sufficiently advanced technology is almost indistinguishable from magic, right? So I'm not a Luddite, pretty obviously, right? But one of the things that Postman points out is, look, once upon a time, if you wanted to become an engaged political actor, you'd have to do things like read newspapers or read books. Now, that might seem very boring for us today, but think about the amount of time it takes to read an entire newspaper, which is what people used to do, right? It was hours and hours worth of reading, where people would just digest long-form content. And at least most newspapers would give you a pretty good sense of what multiple sides had to say about something, right? You'd have your left-wing columnist, you'd have your right-wing columnist, you have someone in the center, and you'd read a few of them all, you digest them, you deliberate, and you think about them. And Postman's example of the kind of society that this produces is actually the debates that Abraham Lincoln had with different anti-abolitionists, right? Where he said people would sometimes sit down for 6 hours to listen to them go back and forth, mincing the granular arguments for and against slavery. Seems a bit ridiculous now, but that's the way things are. And Postman says, whatever you think about this, there's a high level of sophistication that is evidenced in these kinds of debates and in these kinds of approaches to knowledge, because you have to understand the subject matter in more depth and be able to mince the minutiae of a wide variety of different traditions. Now, this isn't everybody, but it's a larger segment of the population, Postman thinks, than say now, right? Where most of us don't even read a book a year, right? Instead, what we do is we want little tidbits of, Ben Shapiro destroying, woke activists, picking on whatever 18-year-old comes to his, in front of them then or now. And I think that all of this has had a extremely negative influence on the culture because it means that we don't engage in sufficiently robust detail with the often very complicated situations that we find ourselves in. And I'm not saying that conservatives are uniquely blamed for this. I think it's the media environment that's to blame for this. But certainly they have done very little to abet this kind of dumbing down of our culture. And I think that we are all the poorer for it.
So in the book, you talk a little bit about UK politics and Brexit. So I'll skip over that question here just in the interest of time. But one question that I
don't want to relitigate. We don't want to relitigate Brexit for like the billionth time.
But I wondered if you had any thoughts on whether you would consider Putin to be a postmodern conservative in any sense. So I know that a lot of the sort of right-wing figures in the Anglosphere have, looked at methods that Putin has used to sort of manipulate information, make it difficult for people to perceive what's real from what's fake and things like that. And I wondered whether, he could be considered a postmodern conservative, or is that, too much of a weird category to apply to Russian thought and the kind of, dimension he's coming at politics from?
That's a very interesting question. So there's a very good book on this by called Black Winds, White Snow by Clover, right? The Rise of Russia's New Nationalism. I think it was for Princeton University Press. But one of the things that he talks about at great length is the kind of real disconnect that emerged in the post-Soviet era, where people like Putin kind of suddenly found themselves in a whole new world. And what's interesting about this book is he points out that for many Russians in the 1990s, they realized that, look, Russia is going to one day, hopefully again, be a major power in the globe. But the ideology that we relied upon to kind of give us a sense of what it is that we were trying to do in the globe for such a long time was communism. And now we don't have any. So what is it that we stand for? And one of the interesting things that Clover points out is that the Russian military would often just pick up any random intellectual that they could find, bring them to military offices and say, hey, do you want a job? We can't pay you any money, but you can have an apartment, vodka, food, and some kind of a special position, and just cook up an ideology for us, right? And they did this with all kinds of people. And most of them were relatively young, late 20s, early mid 30s, reasonable amount of education, and they had vague and shall we say complicated relationships to the old Soviet system. On the one hand, many of them became pretty stridently right-wing quite quickly because they had a lot of disdain for the failures of communism, and they also were deeply contemptuous of the egalitarian universalism that they associate with it. On the other hand, and this is something that a lot of people don't understand about Russian conservatism, they also associated the Soviet Union, especially in the 1990s, with the period of time where Russia really was a great power, right? It was the second power of the world. It commanded respect from more or less everybody, and at least aspired to a kind of worldwide dominion. And so they had very little sympathy for, shall we say, the ideological bases of communism, but a lot of sympathy for the period where Russia or the Soviet Union was a major world power, and also naturally a great deal of contempt for American liberalism, which I saw as responsible for destroying or militating against the Soviet Union and ultimately helping to bring it down and humiliating the people. And it's out of this atmosphere that you see Russian nationalism really start to germinate in the thinking of people like, say, Alexander Dugin, for example, who I've written about before. And many of these authors, quite interestingly, were very willing to draw upon postmodern themes extremely expressly. Just to give an example from Dugin's Fourth Political Theory, he constantly will appeal to postmodern authors like Foucault, Deleuze, etc., to argue that when America or Americanism presents itself as a kind of universal morality that should be spread around the globe, that is just clearly untrue, right? We're postmodern enough to think that any such assertion of universalism is just bound to fail in some way, shape, or form. And Dugin uses that as a basis to argue for Eurasianism and Russian nationalism, and this idea that once we reject universalism, we recognize that each people or narod has its own distinct kind of ethical identity. Although, of course, it shouldn't be the people that ultimately rule. Instead, it should be the single ones, right? Right-wing intellectuals and their leaders. Now, in terms of Putin, it's unclear to me how much of this he really takes seriously, right? I happen to be of the school of thought that Putin is just a Machiavellian operator right down to his very bones, but he recognizes the necessity of a kind of ideological warfare and presenting Russia as having a kind of ideological mission in order to sanction, say, imperial interventions around the globe in places like the Ukraine. And he also is very familiar with the need to propagate this ideology around the globe through things like, digital interventions. And he's been very successful at doing so, right? So is Putin a postmodern conservative? I would say no if you're talking about his inner convictions. Yes, if you're talking about the effect that he's having on the globe. And really, since I'm a materialist, I'd say that the effect is what matters more.
Okay, great. And then my last question then is about Trump 2025. And if you could kind of unpack the influences of postmodern conservatism in Trump's kind of current political expressions. And then also, obviously, I think there's some influences there in J.D. Vance's politics and the way that he approaches things. And Musk, who's going to have an insane amount of power for strange reasons in the upcoming government as well in the US. So what are the influences of postmodern conservatism on Trump 2025 and that kind of government?
Well, I think that people often underestimate how useful it is to actually pay attention to what Trump says. I think we've all kind of tuned him out so much because boy, oh boy, does he talk a lot, that people just kind of are like, oh, God, again. But if you actually pay close attention to what he talks about, his kind of ideological outlook or the constancies of his ideological outlook become a lot more clear. And this goes all the way back to the 1980s. So in the 1980s, which was kind of the height of the postmodern era in many respects, and Trump was very much stamped by this, he releases a book, The Art of the Deal, right? Which can actually ghostwritten, I should say, because Trump wouldn't write something himself. And it very much gives you some interesting insights into his worldview and indeed into his approach to truth. So in one of the most telling passages of the book, Trump very much echoes a longstanding conservative claim about the importance of sublime politics, where he says, look, very few people actually think big, that's his term, about the world, but they get very excited by people that do. They want to believe that they're part of something that is the biggest and the greatest and the most exciting. And he says, I play to that. I play to people's fantasies. It's what he calls truthful hyperbole, an innocent, quote unquote, form of exaggeration that allows you to kind of market yourself as the next big thing. And you can see very clearly how he extended precisely this outlook to his politics, where Trump is not all that interested or even concerned with the truth of what it is that he says in this kind of nebbish intellectual way. What he's concerned about is the affects that it conjures in people. They're feeling that it happens to be true because it connects with this yearning that they have to participate in something that is bigger and grander and more resplendent than themselves. And obviously he has an enormous appeal that way. I think that many on the left, and I'd include myself in this, right, found it hard to take him seriously precisely because he can come across as a kind of clownish figure and underestimated how his charisma and his ability to be a very successful salesman, which he's always good at, right, can really captivate at the political level. So a lot of us have some serious soul searching to do. And probably will get, definitely now, post-2024, right? Now, the way that I frame his epistemic outlook is by drawing upon the philosopher Harry Frankfurt, right? Harry Frankfurt wrote a classic essay called On Bullshit, which people might not think is a serious philosophical topic, but Frankfurt points out it is. And he says, look, we have to distinguish between a liar and a bullshitter because they are very different beings. A liar is somebody who actually has a pretty good understanding of what the truth is. And I think, for instance, Putin would be a liar, right? He has an understanding of what the truth is and consciously decides to present a view of reality that is alternate to what the truth is. And Frankfurt points out, to be a good liar, you have to have a very good understanding of the world the way that it is, because otherwise you won't be able to successfully present this alternative vision. By contrast, he says, a bullshitter is just somebody who is indifferent to the question of truth, right? Just doesn't take it very seriously at all. He relies on his instincts, and he approaches reality as a kind of plastic medium into which he projects his fantasies, his will, etc., and tries to convince other people to participate in that fantasy and that will. And Frankfurt points out, bullshitters have always had an important cachet because, to use the Nietzsche expression, many of us are very often very bored by the truth of the world, find it mundane or depressing or disappointing. And bullshit, right, allows us to kind of escape from that into this much more exciting and dynamic world where anything can seem possible as long as we kind of will it to be. And bullshit is a much harder thing to fight against than untruth because, and his example is Richard Nixon. People who are liars, when you call them out on it, very clearly feel ashamed at that, or they feel like they've been caught red-handed saying something that they weren't supposed to. Whereas, bullshitters, if you point out that what they're saying is untrue, they'll just double down on it, or they'll pivot, or they'll treat it like it's of no consequence whatsoever. Because to invoke the kind of the gospel, quotation, they adopt this kind of attitude that Pilate adopted towards Christ, where Christ said, I stand for the truth, or look for truth, and Pilate was like, well, what is truth, right? Who knows? Okay, and I think that in many ways we've entered into an era of bullshitting, especially propagated through online media. And I can really see no way out of that. That's kind of the depressing message that I have to bring to us right now. I'm doing my best to try to be a kind of counterforce to that, and I know many people on the right and left are also. But the forces arraigned against this are immense, and there's not really a lot of optimism that I have that things are going to change anytime soon.
So how would you kind of contrast, Vance to Trump then? Do you think that he's similarly a bullshitter? Is he more Machiavellian? Would either of them be more in line with what you're characterizing as postmodern conservatism than the other?
I think that Vance initially is not. I don't think that Vance is as good a bullshitter as Trump is, right? And I think you could really see this in his debate with Tim Walz, where actually I should say he performed quite well, right? But when people basically prodded Vance by suggesting that what he was saying was untrue, or that he was spouting, fake news, as it were, he looked very consciously uncomfortable. And I think that's because a small core of Vance is still committed to this older way of approaching truth. And he feels anxious, or if you want to put it this way, unhappy about being called out about something that's untrue, right? But again, qual the kind of Putin comment, I'm not really, that's just me speculating, I should say, about him. I really don't know. I don't know the guy, right? I'm not really all that concerned with the kind of inner state of someone's souls and whether or not they're willfully lying and they feel somewhat bad about it, or they're just bullshitting. What really matters is the kind of consequences of their actions. And I think that it's very clear that Vance tends to bring about some extremely negative consequences for millions of people living in the United States, indeed for millions of Americans who are probably going to be extremely hurt by the immense cuts in government services that people like, say, Elon Musk and Vivek are promising soon. So
in terms of sort of responding to this new type of politics that doesn't have a conservative truth, what do you think the best strategies are? People should how should people respond to it? Is it through debate and discourse? Is debate and discourse does it just have no real purpose anymore because of the lack of concern for truth? Is it just through waiting for the next election and hoping people make different choices next time, or something like that?
Well, I think I can only speak here from a kind of left perspective. So given, our own political inclinations differ a little bit about this, maybe you have a different kind of idea on it, and I'd be happy to hear what that is. But I think that, as I mentioned, the left really needs to recover the commitment to universalistic rationality that was characteristic of its discourse at the peak of our influence, right? I'll give an example of this. So at the height of the French Revolution, Mary Wollstonecraft engaged in a lengthy debate with Edmund Burke. And Wollstonecraft actually charged Burke with having, and I quote, a mortal antipathy to reason, because he would just declaim wildly in favor of tradition and institutions and hierarchies where they had been long-standing, and would often offer what you called a kind of Gothic defense of them, right? That we should revere them because they've served us well, and whether or not they're particularly good, they're nonetheless our values, our traditions, our hierarchies, our kings, our nobles, right? And she said, look, it might all be very well to call someone to have a kind of filial attachment to their rulers, but where the ivy chokes out new growth, who wouldn't cut it down, right? And she goes on to say, look, the all-sham regimes of Europe just really are doing a big crappy job of securing the benefits that ordinary people lead flourishing lives. Yeah, maybe some people might like the idea of reverencing the monarchy because they find it exciting or sacred or whatever. But if it's actively harming people in a way that you can prove, why wouldn't you sit there and say maybe it's best to enact a kind of change, right? And I think it's this style of argumentation that the left really needs to recover, and solidaristically as well, right? Trying to make the case that this isn't just going to be good for X, Y, or Z groups, although it will be, right? But for everybody, ultimately, except potentially our plutocratic masters. Now, how does this relate back to debate? I do think that this has an alignment with a willingness to go out there, argue for your positions, and to try to persuade the general public that their lives will be benefited through things like, let's go to the American example, Medicare for all, right? And I think that at least some on the left have been wary about doing this because they feel that debating people that they disagree with kind of platforms them or legitimates them in a certain way. You saw a very good example of this when Kamala Harris wasn't exactly very proactive in trying to go on Joe Rogan recently, although I definitely don't think Kamala Harris is a leftist by any stretch of the imagination, nor do I think she ran a left campaign, right? But many progressives kind of pressured her not to go do this. I think that's a serious mistake, right? If you are genuinely committed to this idea of liberty, equality, and solidarity for all, you have to trust that you can reach people reasonably through argumentation, and that if left positions really are the best ones, which I believe they are, right, we can persuade people that they are by demonstrating that adopting them and putting them into action will make their lives tangibly better. So that's what I would like to see going forward in the future. Whether or not that will actually happen, I don't know, right? I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm definitely been never very good at even predicting whether my sports teams are going to win. So I'm not going to, make any predictions in that thing.
Great. Well, I'll wrap up the interview there then. Thank you for coming on and talk about your book and going through all those questions. Is there anywhere that you would want to kind of direct people to if they're interested in more of your work? Where would you send them?
Sure, you can add me on Twitter. It's always going to be Twitter for me, at Matt Paul Prof, or you can email me, mattmcmanus300 at gmail.com. I try to do my best to respond to emails. Just do me a favor, if you do email me, try to keep it really brief at the beginning. I sometimes get these long fucking emails that are like pages and pages long, and that's not a diss, right? I really appreciate that people are thoughtful and that they want to share these things with me. It's a lot if I don't know you to kind of read through 5 pages of material. Maybe just like, hey, I wanted to share some thoughts with you, and let's chat, and then we can kick things off from there. Great,
appreciate it. Or there are a couple of questions in the chat that came in a bit late. And Justin is saying you should come over to Blue Sky as well. I don't know.
I am. Yeah, I'm on Blue Sky.
Oh, you're on Blue Sky as well. Yeah. Great.
I got like fucking 1,500 followers in the last 2 days, which is bizarre. But
cool.
So, there's a big exodus that's going on. So.
So Pavel had a question actually earlier where he said, did chaos theory that emerged in the early 2000s have any consequence on political science? I mean, that might be a hard question to really...
I have never seen anybody who has made that kind of argument. I can tell you that, well, 2 things. First off, political scientists, and I include myself in this, aren't always the best at reading carefully the most recent developments and, say, scientific and mathematical literatures. Often, we're comfortable with engaging the popularizations, and I include myself in this. Like, I like reading the odd book on physics or biology, right? But whether, most political scientists understand that stuff in any great depth, I would be quite skeptical of it. Although, to defend my own discipline, whenever I see people like Richard Dawkins, for example, try to weigh in on political and moral issues, I'm usually like, oh, just God, just shoot me right now, right? Anyway, doesn't matter. I certainly do not know of any preeminent political scientist who has drawn extensively on chaos theory. I could very well be wrong on this. I do know some political theorists who have tried to draw inspiration from quantum theory to develop novel ways of conceiving things like law. Orange Tribe did some of that not too long ago, and there was an interesting book on Strauss and Plato I read recently that tried to argue that Platonism was compatible with recent developments in quantum theory. It was called After Leo Strauss, right? But whether any of those are particularly sophisticated or demonstrate a deep understanding of these contemporary developments in the maths and sciences, I really don't know. I'm be wary of making that claim.
Reflective Journey asks, would Heidegger fall in the category of postmodern conservative?
I would say no, but and I know that's a dissatisfactory answer. So look, I was hugely influenced by Heidegger when I was around 18, 19. In fact, I considered myself a Heideggerian right up until I guess I was about 25 because I was just obsessed with the guy. So I don't want to give too long a lecture on this, but without a doubt, Heidegger has profoundly influenced, I should say, many of the kind of emerging new right or postmodern right intellectuals that have appeared on the scene now. People like Dugin, who I mentioned before, and his disciple Michael Millerman. Steve Bannon was hugely influenced by a kind of low-grade version of Heidegger's theory. Many people, on the kind of online right, at least, will draw inspiration from him or reference him. And that's true of many authors that emerged during what's sometimes called the German Conservative Revolution. For people who don't know, the German Conservative Revolution is a series of intellectuals who wrote during the time period of the Weimar Republic. People like Carl Schmitt, Spengler, Heidegger, etc., all of whom were conservative in the sense of rejecting the Weimar Republic, but revolutionary in the sense that they didn't just want to go back to the Austrian regime of imperial Germany, right? They felt that there was this need to establish a new kind of right-wing society that would echo what came before, but also have many new components. And many of these figures ended up, of course, supporting Nazism. If you think about people like Heidegger or Schmitt, or, they became, if not fellow travelers, at least an influence on Nazism, like Spengler. I'm happy to elaborate more on this, right? I can talk about Heidegger for a long time, but that's just the short answer. I would say that he's an influence, but wouldn't fall decisively in this category for all kinds of philosophical reasons that we can talk about if you want.
A couple more questions come in as well, but I'm just wondering, are you okay for time with those, or do you want to wrap it? Like, I don't mind. I'm fine for time, but I want to respect your time. So.
Yeah, no, I'm fine with taking a few more questions. I don't got to be anywhere for another, I guess, like 20 minutes.
Okay, cool. The dude asks, what do you think of the trend of left people abandoning Twitter/X?
I sympathize it without actually engaging it myself, right? Look, I would never, ever chastise anybody for wanting to leave a space for the sake of their mental health or because they think that they have other things to do with their time, right? And a lot of people I know, and I really understand this, just got tired of being berated by Nazis. And I don't mean, normie conservatives. I mean like the kind of people who will talk about how Hitler was right on Twitter all the time, right? It does get frustrating after a point. Like, who wants to fucking have to deal with somebody who's just like, you're just in the service of the Jews, right? Or you look like a bugman to me, all day long. It's just kind of like, what am I doing with my life kind of attitude. I personally plan on staying on Twitter because I think it's important to kind of get a sense of what the right is thinking, and B, I think it's also important to try to win converts in those spaces, right? The reality is that the left and liberals are going to have to try to win people over to our views somewhere. And we're not going to do that by just speaking to ourselves, because then we're just reaching to the converted. So I plan on staying. You can find me there if you want. But if anybody wanted to leave it, I would say by all means do so. I'm certainly not going to sit there and stop you or say that you're making a mistake.
then inquires about, asked a question about whether or not you think Trump is a fascist. And I wonder, what your view is on the whole. Obviously, there's a whole discourse of it. Is the label fascism being sort of overused, right, in contemporary politics? Is that watering it down? Or is our politics so sort of extreme now that we're actually appropriately using it, but the kind of, the force of it's been rhetorically blunted by people saying it's being overused or something? What do you have a take on this? Do you think that it's being appropriately used, or what is the appropriate use of the term fascist?
Yeah, if people want, they can either read my book, The Political Right and Equality, where I address this in some length, or if you don't want to buy that, which I understand many people don't, you can look up an article I wrote for The Unpopulist called what kind of authoritarianism is Trump, or what kind of authoritarianism is Trumpism. I can't remember the title of my own article. I apologize. But anyway, just look up my name for Unpopulist and I'll be there. But the short answer is I would say no with a but again. So fascism is without a doubt, as you pointed out, one of the most overused terms in the political lexicon, especially in online circumstances, right? So everyone calls everyone a fascist today. Obviously, many people in the Democratic Party accuse Trump of fascism. Trump himself accused Kamala Harris of being both a communist and a fascist and an authoritarian and everything else under the sun, right? So I think that it is definitely time for us to stop just throwing out that term loosely to the point where it loses any kind of analytical specificity. However, there are many different definitions of fascism that have been given, and I think that if we look at some of the more granular of them, there's definitely a genetic similarity or genetic symmetry between Trumpism and fascism. So I'll just very briefly get into this, right? So the definition of fascism that I think is most appropriate is Roger Griffin's in his classic book, The Nature of Fascism, and also, things like the Oxford Fascism Reader, that kind of thing, where he characterizes fascism as a kind of populist palingenetic ultranationalism. Okay, so let's break that down. He says that fascism is populist in the sense that it is not conservative in the European sense of the word. Fascists believe that the people have an active role to play in politics. Now, that does not mean a democratic role, obviously, in fascism, but they are supposed to be energized and mobilized by things like the fascist leader. It is palingenetic in the sense that it feels that the ultranation has been in a state of decline for a long period of time. This means that a restoration is necessary. You can see that even in terminology like "Make America Great Again," right? And this restoration can only be accomplished through faith and commitment to the leadership of the fascist party and, of course, the fascist leader. And it's ultra-nationalist in the sense of believing that what Griffin calls the ultranation is the kind of moral horizon through which people gain a sense of meaning in their life and ultimately a sense of who they are and where they belong. And so you take this all together, what you have are figures like Mussolini or Hitler who say, our nation has been undermined by the presence of class conflict stoked by socialists and communists. It has also become weak because of the presence of feminists who are undermining our kind of masculine power and liberals who think that all politics should be is a kind of deliberation in parliament that's invariably sclerotic and slow. And many fascists will also be extremely critical of conservatives, although in a complicated way that I'll get to in a second, because they'll say that older conservatives have fundamentally failed in holding back the rising tide of libertinism and decadence. And they're often characterized as a kind of out-of-touch elite embodying economic interests who are out of touch with the ordinary people and what's required. Now, what Griffin points out, and Paxton also makes that point, is that very often in order to come to power, what fascists will do is try to form tactical alliances with traditional conservative elites. For instance, in Nazi Germany, the Nazis entered into coalition with more conventionally conservative German National People's Party. In Italy, of course, it was the monarch who invited the fascists to form a government with the support of big business and tacit consent of at least some conservative Catholics, because they felt that the fascists would crack down on socialist unions, that kind of thing, right? But once in power, fascists tend to implement a much more radical program of reform than anything that conservatives would be comfortable with, particularly in the Nazi case study, right, where this idea was a kind of revolutionary transformation of Germany into a home for the German people, the pure German people, stripped of all the kind of weakening factors and weakening figures that kind of poisoned the blood of the people. Now, what's the relationship of this to Trump, right? Well, they often say that history doesn't repeat itself. That's a mistake, but it does rhyme, right? And I think that there is no doubt that Trump appeals to a similar kind of urge for palingenetic renewal, right? This idea that the nation is the primary site of people's sense of meaning and people's sense of community and identity. It has been undermined by the spread of weakness brought about by the presence of foreigners and their allies in elite liberal institutions. And what was required is faith in a strongman type figure who is charismatic and who speaks for the people, but only for the real people, not necessarily for all those who are decadent or corrupted by the presence of foreign ideas, left ideas, that kind of thing. The core difference, I think, between fascism and what we see now with right populism, and this is a distinction I take from Finkelstein, is that fascists made no bones about their contempt for democracy and democratic values, right? They were insistent that democracy was not only a decadent, but a kind of sclerotic, dull system of political organization. And all that you really needed to have a kind of populist system was a leader who spoke for the people, right? In fact, some fascist theorists like Carl Schmitt expressly said that a dictatorship can be more democratic than an actual democracy as long as the leader really speaks for the general will. Now, most right populists in power still, particularly in the 21st century, still want to hold things like elections, for example. They don't just do away with democracy. However, they are certainly not averse to gaming elections and not even tinkering, but quite slowly but consistently transforming electoral systems in order to shore up their own power, expel their enemies, or at least marginalize their enemies, and make it very difficult for liberal and progressive groups to take back power once right populists have won it. This is sometimes referred to as a kind of competitive authoritarianism. And usually the model that's pointed to is Hungary under Viktor Orban, right? If you go to Hungary, there's still elections that are held, but the state for the most part controls the media. The ruling party Fidesz has gerrymandered the shit out of the entire country, so it's extremely unlikely that even popular opposition parties can win a sufficient number of seats to exercise any kind of power. The judiciary is in his pocket. Most of the wealthy people are either aligned with Fidesz or very much in the debt of Fidesz. And so any election that happens is gamed to essentially produce the result that the ruling party wants. And I'm quite concerned that a very similar kind of model could be implemented in the United States. And that's not just speculation. If you read my article, I point out that numerous figures on the American right, including Trump himself, have expressed deep admiration for Orban and Orbanism. And things like Nat Khan, for example, have often talked about how the Hungarian model is one for the American conservative movement to try to implement, right? So that's like my kind of long-winded answer to that question. There's definitely genetic parallels to fascism and right populism. Some people like Robert Paxson, who's one of the great American commentators on fascism, have said that Trump is just overtly a fascist. I wouldn't go that far yet. But just because he is not strictly a fascist does not mean that there's not enough of that in there to be deeply worried. And the reality is that there are many other bad things in the world on the political right than just fascism. And we should be extremely critical of it for that reason.
Great. Thanks for that. So there were a few more questions, but I think if we wrap it up there, just because some of them I think were covered in the answers. So yeah, if we leave it there, but thank you, Dog, for your super chat as well. I don't know if I agree with that, but thank you for the super chat nevertheless. Right, so yeah, to end it there, thanks, Matt. Thank you for your time. Thank you for answering the audience questions. People can find you then on Twitter, Blue Sky as well. And obviously, leave a comment on the channel, share this video around if you found it interesting, to help promote it in the algorithm as well. Thank you.
They're up. Thanks, Nathan.